He left the safe open on purpose. It was a trap. Jimmy Thomas had everything money could buy: mansions, companies, private jets, and power. Yet his heart was emptier than any vault he owned. Betrayed by friends, partners, and even family, he no longer trusted anyone. So when a quiet black maid named Grace Graham entered his home, he decided to test her. Not with words, not with cameras she could see, but with temptation. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe integrity still exists in this world, hit that subscribe button, because this story might restore your faith in humanity. Jimmy Thomas hadn't always been this way. There was a time when his laughter echoed through conference rooms, when his handshake meant something, when the name Thomas Shipping International represented more than profit margins and stock portfolios. It represented legacy, vision, trust. That was before Lydia, before Evan, before Daniel, before he learned that the people closest to you could carve out your heart with surgical precision while smiling to your face. Now at 45, Jimmy sat alone in his penthouse estate, overlooking Atlanta's glittering skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting he no longer cared to admire. 32 floors below, life pulsed with energy, ambition, hope. Up here in this temperature-controlled sanctuary of marble and glass, there was only silence. And silence, Jimmy had learned, was the only thing that never disappointed. His penthouse spanned the entire top floor, 12,000 square feet of curated emptiness, the finest Italian furniture, original artwork worth millions, a wine cellar stocked with bottles older than most of his employees. Yet despite all this abundance, Jimmy ate his meals alone at a table built for 12. He hadn't hosted a dinner party in 3 years. The betrayals had come like dominoes, each one knocking down another piece of his faith in humanity. First, there was Lydia Thomas, his fiancée of 2 years, the woman he'd planned to build a family with. He'd discovered her affair with his cousin Marcus on what should have been their engagement anniversary. She hadn't even had the decency to look ashamed when he confronted them. Just entitled, as if she deserved both his name and his cousin's affection. Then came Evan Brooks, his business partner since college. 20 years of friendship, late nights building the company, shared dreams and risks. Evan had systematically embezzled $4.7 million over 18 months. The forensic accountants called it sophisticated fraud. Jimmy called it what it was, theft dressed in friendship's clothing. But the deepest cut came from family. Daniel Thomas, his younger brother, had sold company secrets to their biggest competitor. Not because he needed money. Daniel had a trust fund. He did it out of jealousy, out of resentment, out of some twisted need to prove he could hurt the brother who had always protected him. The lawsuit was still ongoing. These weren't isolated incidents, they were lessons. Brutal, expensive lessons that taught Jimmy a singular truth. People loved what he could give them, not who he was. Remove the money, the power, the influence, and watch how quickly love evaporated. So he built walls. Not physical ones, though his security system cost more than most people's homes. He built walls around his heart, his trust, his capacity for human connection. He conducted business through lawyers and intermediaries. He vetted everyone who entered his space with background checks that would make the FBI envious. He kept people at arm's length, exactly where they couldn't stab him in the back. It was safer this way. Lonelier, yes, but safer. Grace Graham arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. She came through the service entrance, as all household staff did, carrying nothing but a small purse and quiet dignity. 27 years old, slim build, with eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations without speaking a word. Her uniform was crisp and modest, her movements careful and respectful. She didn't try to make small talk with the other staff members. She didn't ask invasive questions about Mr. Thomas's personal life, as so many others had. She simply worked. Jimmy watched her on the security monitors. He watched everyone, but with Grace, he found himself paying closer attention. Not because she did anything suspicious, the opposite. She did everything correctly, perfectly, almost invisibly. She cleaned his office without touching the papers on his desk. She vacuumed around furniture without bumping into anything. She polished surfaces until they gleamed, then quietly disappeared. Most people who entered Jimmy's world wanted to be seen. They angled for recognition, for conversation, for proximity to power. Grace seemed to want the opposite. She lowered her eyes when he passed. She stepped aside to let him through doorways first. She made herself small. It intrigued him. "Background check?" Jimmy asked Marcus Reed, his head of security, during their weekly briefing. Marcus pulled up Grace's file on his tablet. Clean, no criminal record, no debts beyond her father's medical bills from 2 years ago. Works 2 jobs currently. This one and weekend shifts at a nursing home. Lives with her mother in East Point. Younger brother named Caleb, 19. Currently in remission from leukemia but facing complications. Jimmy studied the information. References? Excellent. Previous employers describe her as honest, hard-working, never missed a shift. One called her the most trustworthy person I've ever employed. Trustworthy. The word tasted foreign in Jimmy's mouth. He'd heard it before. About Lydia, about Evan, about Daniel. Everyone seemed trustworthy until they weren't. Until the moment arrived when integrity collided with opportunity, and opportunity always won. Always. "Keep monitoring," Jimmy said quietly. Marcus nodded, understanding without needing explanation. In this house, everyone was monitored. Everyone was a potential threat until proven otherwise. The idea came to Jimmy 3 weeks after Grace started working for him. He was reviewing security footage late one night, unable to sleep as usual, when he watched Grace clean his private study. She moved with the same careful precision she always did. When her phone rang, she stepped into the hallway to answer it, never bringing personal business into his space. Professional, respectful, exactly what anyone would want in an employee. But Jimmy had learned that professionalism was just a mask people wore until they found something worth removing it for. Everyone had a price. Everyone had a breaking point. And he was going to find Grace Graham's. Not because he wanted her to fail. God, how he wished she wouldn't. But because he needed to know. He needed concrete proof, irrefutable evidence that his cynicism was either justified or could finally be put to rest. The safe in his study held approximately $80,000 in cash. Various pieces of jewelry worth another $100,000. Legal documents, investment records. Everything a struggling young woman with medical bills and financial pressure could desperately need. All he had to do was leave it open. The test was simple, elegant, cruel perhaps, but necessary. Jimmy stood in his study that evening, his hand on the safe's heavy door. The mechanisms clicked softly as he deliberately left it ajar, just enough to be noticed, just enough to tempt. The cameras would capture everything, and then he would know. He would finally know if there was one honest person left in this corrupted world, or if Grace Graham was just another beautiful lie, waiting to reveal its ugly truth. Jimmy settled into his office chair, pulled up the live security feed and waited. His heart, that organ he'd thought was beyond feeling, beat with something that felt dangerously close to hope. And that terrified him more than any betrayal ever could. Grace Graham had learned to move through wealthy spaces like a ghost. It was a survival skill she'd developed over 5 years of domestic work. Be present but invisible, efficient but unobtrusive, see everything, acknowledge nothing. The rich valued their privacy above all else, and the best way to keep a job in their world was to make them forget you were even there. But on this particular Thursday afternoon, as she pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway toward Mr. Thomas's private study, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, thicker, or maybe that was just her anxiety talking. Grace hadn't slept well the night before. Her mother's voice still echoed in her head from their phone call at midnight. Caleb's complications were worsening. The doctors were recommending a specialized treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. $18,000. They needed $18,000 they didn't have. "We'll figure it out, Mama," Grace had whispered into the phone, though she had no idea how. Her mother, Martha Graham, had raised Grace and Caleb alone after their father died. She'd worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, had sacrificed everything so her children could have opportunities she never did. And now, at 62, with arthritis making her hands shake and her back constantly aching, Martha still cleaned houses 6 days a week. Grace couldn't let her mother carry this burden alone. She reached Mr. Thomas's study and knocked softly, a habit even though she knew he was in meetings downtown. No answer. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The study was her favorite room in the penthouse, though she'd never admit that to anyone. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that actually looked read, not just decorative. A massive mahogany desk sat near the windows, papers neatly stacked, pens arranged precisely. Everything in its place. Everything except... Grace froze. The safe, Mr. Thomas's private safe, built into the wall behind a sliding panel that was usually closed, stood open. Not wide open, but enough. Enough to see inside. Enough to see the neat stacks of cash bundled with paper bands. Enough to see the glint of jewelry, the leather folders, the watches in their cases. Her heart began to race. This wasn't right. Mr. Thomas was meticulous about security. He locked everything, checked everything twice. There was no way he would leave his safe open unless he forgot. Unless he was testing someone. Grace's hands gripped the handle of her cleaning cart so tightly, her knuckles went white. She should leave. She should report this immediately. She should not take another step toward that safe. But her feet moved anyway. Just to close it, she told herself. Just to protect Mr. Thomas's belongings. That's what a good employee would do. She crossed the Persian rug slowly, her footsteps silent. The safe seemed to grow larger as she approached, its contents more visible. She could see the denominations now, $100 bills, lots of them. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. More money than she needed to save Caleb. Grace stopped 3 feet away, her breath coming faster now. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, but she ignored it. She couldn't look away from the safe. $18,000, that's all she needed, and there had to be 10 times that amount sitting right there, just waiting. Her phone vibrated again, more insistent this time. With trembling hands, Grace pulled it from her pocket. Her mother's name flashed on the screen. She stepped back from the safe and answered. "Mama?" "Grace." Her mother's voice was thick with tears. "Baby, the hospital just called. They're saying if we can't make the down payment by tomorrow, they'll have to postpone Caleb's treatment. And the doctor said, he said we can't wait much longer." Couldn't be alone with this temptation. She needed to do the right thing, even though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to do the easy thing. Grace found Marcus Reed in the security office on the lower level. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice barely steady. "I need to report something. Mr. Thomas is safe and it's open. In his study, I think he should know." Marcus looked up from his monitors, his expression unreadable. "Open." "Yes, sir, I didn't touch anything. I just thought he should know." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Grace felt like he could see right through her, could see the war that had just raged in her soul. "Thank you, Grace," he finally said. "I'll take care of it." She nodded and left, her hands still shaking. Grace made it through the rest of her shift on autopilot. She cleaned bathrooms she barely saw, dusted surfaces she couldn't focus on, vacuumed carpets while her mind was miles away. At Grady Memorial Hospital, where Caleb lay in pain, in her mother's tired eyes. In that open safe. By 6 o'clock, when her shift ended, Grace couldn't bring herself to leave. She told herself she was just being thorough, making sure everything was perfect. But the truth was darker than that. The truth was she wanted one more chance. One more opportunity to be alone with that safe. She waited until the other staff members left, then slowly climbed the stairs back to Mr. Thomas's study. Her heart pounded with each step. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. But Caleb's face kept appearing in her mind, and her father's voice seemed more distant now. The study door was unlocked. Grace pushed it open. The safe was still there, still open, still filled with more money than her family would see in a lifetime. This was her second chance, maybe her last chance. She crossed the room like a woman in a trance, her conscience screaming at her to stop, her desperation pulling her forward. She knelt in front of the safe, her knees hitting the hardwood floor. Up close, the money was even more real. She could see the serial numbers on the bills, could smell the paper and ink, could imagine how it would feel in her hands. Tears began to fall. "Please, God," she whispered, "please don't make me choose. Please don't make me be this person." But God was silent. The decision was hers alone. Grace reached toward the stacks of money, her fingers trembling. Just $5,000. Just enough to save Caleb. Mr. Thomas would never know. He had so much, and she needed so little. Her fingers touched the first bundle. Then she heard her father's voice again, Crystal clear this time. Once you trade it away, you can never get it back. Grace pulled her hand back as if the money had burned her. She sat there on her knees, tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking with sobs she couldn't contain. She cried for Caleb, for her mother, for the unfairness of a world where some people had everything and others had nothing. But mostly she cried for herself, for the woman she almost became. Finally, when the tears slowed, Grace reached up with steady hands and slowly pushed the safe door closed. The lock clicked into place with a sound that felt like finality. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry, but I won't become that person. I can't." She stood, wiped her eyes and turned toward the door. She didn't see the camera in the corner, its red light blinking softly. She didn't know that Jimmy Thomas was watching from his downtown office, his hand frozen on his mouse, his breath caught in his throat. She didn't know that her choice had just changed everything. Grace simply walked away, her integrity intact even as her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Jimmy Thomas hadn't moved from his chair in 20 minutes. The security footage had ended, but he kept staring at the frozen image on his screen. Grace Graham, kneeling before his safe, tears streaming down her face, reaching toward the money, then pulling back, closing the door, walking away. He'd watched the entire sequence 3 times now, and each time it hit him harder. She'd been there, alone, desperate, with every justification in the world to take what she needed. No witnesses, no consequences, just survival. And she'd walked away. Jimmy's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He called Marcus. "Sir?" Marcus answered on the first ring. "Is Grace still in the building?" "Yes, sir, she just left the study. Heading toward the service elevator now." "Stop her. Tell her to wait in the main library. I'm coming." "Right away, sir." Jimmy ended the call and sat back in his leather chair, his mind racing. For 3 years, he'd lived in a world painted entirely in shades of betrayal. Every person was a potential threat. Every kindness had an ulterior motive. Every smile hid a knife. And then this young woman, with every reason to prove him right, had instead proven him wrong. He didn't know what to do with that information. Didn't know how to process the strange, uncomfortable feeling blooming in his chest. It felt almost like hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope was the thing that had made him vulnerable to Lydia, to Evan, to Daniel. Hope was what had broken him in the first place. Yet as Jimmy grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, he couldn't deny what he'd witnessed. Grace Graham had passed a test designed for her to fail, and in doing so, she'd cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was permanently sealed. The drive from his office to the penthouse took 18 minutes. Jimmy spent every second of it replaying the footage in his mind. The way Grace had trembled, the way she'd cried, the agony in her posture as she knelt before temptation itself. She hadn't just casually walked past the money. She'd fought a war with herself, and somehow, against all odds, her integrity had won. When Jimmy entered the library, Grace was standing near the window, her back to him. Her shoulders were rigid with tension. She knew something was wrong. People didn't get summoned to wait for Mr. Thomas unless something significant had happened. "Grace," Jimmy said quietly. She turned, and he saw her eyes were still red from crying. She clasped her hands in front of her, professional despite the fear he could see flickering across her face. "Mr. Thomas, I'm sorry, I don't know what—" "You could have taken it," Jimmy interrupted, his voice steady but not cold. "The money in my safe, you could have taken it, and I would have understood why." The color drained from Grace's face. She opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered, You knew?" "I left it open on purpose." Jimmy watched her carefully, waiting for anger, for accusation. It was a test. For a long moment, Grace just stared at him. Then slowly understanding dawned in her eyes. Not rage as he'd expected, but something closer to sadness. "A test," she repeated softly. "Yes." Jimmy moved closer, pulling his phone from his pocket. He queued up the footage and turned the screen toward her. "I watched everything." Grace looked at the image of herself kneeling before the safe, and Jimmy saw shame wash over her features. Not the shame of someone caught stealing, but the shame of someone whose private moment of weakness had been witnessed. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you." Jimmy crossed to his desk and opened a drawer. Inside was an envelope he'd prepared on the drive over, thick with cash. He held it out to her. $50,000 for your honesty. Grace's eyes widened. She looked at the envelope like it might bite her. I don't understand. You passed the test. You proved your integrity when it mattered most. This is your reward. But instead of reaching for the money, Grace took a step backward. Her expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like hurt. No, she said quietly. Jimmy frowned. No, I didn't protect your money for payment, Mr. Thomas. Grace's voice was steady now, stronger. I did it because it was right, because that's who my father raised me to be. If I take that money now, it means I did have a price. It just happened to be higher than what was in your safe. The envelope felt suddenly heavy in Jimmy's hand. He stared at this young woman who'd just refused more money than she'd probably make in 2 years, and felt something crack wider in his chest. I set a trap for you. I manufactured a scenario designed to make you fail, to prove that everyone has a price. I turned my pain into a weapon aimed at an innocent woman who'd done nothing but work honestly for me. Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. What kind of man does that make me? Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the same gentle dignity she'd shown since the day she arrived, she said, It makes you a man who's been hurt. But hurt isn't who you are. Kindness is. The Thomas Foundation proves that. That foundation was built by someone I used to be. Then maybe, Grace said softly, it's time to remember who that was. Jimmy looked at this remarkable woman standing in his library, refusing his money, defending his better nature when he just confessed to testing her like a lab rat. She should be angry. She had every right to walk out and never come back. Instead, she was offering him grace. The irony of her name wasn't lost on him. I want to offer you a position, Jimmy said suddenly. Not as my maid, as part of my foundation's leadership team, someone who can help me remember why we started doing this work in the first place, someone who understands what it means to truly need help. Grace's eyes went wide. Mr. Thomas, I don't have experience in... You have something more valuable than experience. You have integrity that can't be bought, borrowed, or broken. You have perspective I've lost. And you have a heart that still believes in goodness, even when tested in the fire. Jimmy picked up the envelope again. This isn't payment for passing my test. This is an investment in my foundation's future, and a down payment for your brother's treatment. I can't... Yes, you can. Because Shanice deserved her chance at life, and so does Caleb. Because your mother deserves to stop working herself to death. Because you deserve to be valued for exactly who you are. Jimmy held out the envelope again. Please, let me do this. Grace stared at the money, then at Jimmy, then back at the money. He could see the war raging inside her. Pride versus necessity, independence versus wisdom. Finally, with shaking hands, she took the envelope. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. No, Jimmy said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Thank you. You gave me something I thought was gone forever. What's that? Hope that integrity still exists in this world. After Grace left, with promises to think about the foundation position and gratitude she could barely articulate, Jimmy sat alone in his library. He pulled up the security footage one more time, watched Grace close that safe, watched her walk away from temptation, and for the first time in 3 years, Jimmy Thomas smiled. Not the practiced smile of business negotiations or the hollow smile of social obligations, but a real smile, the kind that came from somewhere deep and genuine, from a place he'd thought was dead. Tomorrow he'd call his foundation director. They'd create a position for Grace, something that would let her learn while contributing her unique perspective. They'd expand their programs for families facing medical crises. They'd remember why they started this work. But tonight, Jimmy just sat with a strange, uncomfortable, wonderful feeling of hope. It felt like waking up after a very long, very dark sleep. It felt like coming home. 3 months later, Jimmy Thomas stood in the back of a crowded hotel ballroom and watched a miracle unfold. Not the kind of miracle that defied physics or logic. The quiet kind. The kind that happened when broken people decided to heal. When cynicism gave way to hope. When 2 lives changed each other in ways neither expected. The Thomas Foundation's annual charity gala had always been a grand affair. crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, speeches from politicians and celebrities. But this year felt different. This year, it meant something. Because this year, Grace Graham was speaking. She stood at the podium in a simple navy dress, her hands resting lightly on the wood surface, her voice steady, despite the 300 pairs of eyes watching her. Gone was the young woman who'd lowered her gaze and made herself small. In her place stood someone who'd discovered that integrity didn't require invisibility. "My name is Grace Graham," she began, "and 18 months ago I was cleaning houses to pay my brother's medical bills." The room went silent. Jimmy felt his chest tighten with pride. He'd watched Grace's transformation over these past months, watched her move from hesitant acceptance of her new role to genuine confidence. She'd thrown herself into the foundation's work with the same dedication she'd once given to cleaning his penthouse. But now her voice mattered. Her perspective shaped decisions. Her compassion drove programs. And families were being saved because of it. "I know what it's like to choose between rent and medication," Grace continued. "To lay awake at night doing math that never adds up. To feel like you're drowning while everyone around you breathes easy." In the audience, Jimmy saw people leaning forward. A woman in the third row wiped her eyes. A man in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing his own disconnect from such struggles. "My brother Caleb needed surgery we couldn't afford. The number was impossible. $18,000 might as well have been 18 million, and I was desperate." Grace paused, her eyes finding Jimmy's in the back of the room. "Desperate enough that when I saw an opportunity to take what we needed, I almost did." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "But someone taught me that integrity is the only thing that truly belongs to you. My father said those words when I was 7 years old, and they saved me when I was 27. Because I chose honesty over survival, and that choice changed everything." Grace's voice grew stronger. "The Thomas Foundation didn't just help my family. It reminded me that goodness still exists in this world, that there are people who care about strangers, who give without expecting anything back, who believe that everyone deserves a chance." She gestured to the screens behind her, where photos appeared, families the foundation had helped, children who'd received life-saving treatments, single mothers who'd gotten job training, elderly people who'd found housing. Each face a story, each story a life transformed. "Tonight we're not just raising money," Grace said. "We're raising hope. We're proving that integrity still matters, that compassion isn't weakness, that when we choose to see each other's humanity, we heal more than just medical bills or financial crises. We heal the world." The applause started small, then built like a wave. People rose to their feet. Jimmy stayed in the back, his hands coming together quietly, his eyes never leaving Grace. She'd done this. She'd taken his test, his trap, his cynicism, and transformed it into purpose. No, that wasn't quite right. She'd reminded him of the purpose that had always been there, buried under layers of pain. After the speeches ended, and the formal program gave way to mingling and wine, Jimmy found Grace on the terrace. She stood alone, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, the same view he'd stared at countless nights from his penthouse. But she seemed to see something in those lights he'd forgotten was there. "You were incredible," Jimmy said, joining her at the railing. Grace smiled, the nervous energy from her speech finally settling. "I was terrified." "It didn't show." "Good. I've been practicing in front of my bathroom mirror for 2 weeks." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 3 months ago, this proximity would have been impossible. Grace would have stepped away, maintained professional distance, made herself invisible. Now they simply existed in the same space, equals in the way that mattered most. "Caleb starts college in the fall," Grace said quietly. "Pre-med, he wants to become an oncologist." "Of course he does," Jimmy smiled. "He wants to be the help he needed, just like someone else I know." Jimmy looked at her, saw the knowing expression on her face. "I wasn't always like that. I know you told me, but you're remembering now. I see it." She was right. Over the past 3 months, Jimmy had slowly begun dismantling the walls he'd built. He'd had lunch with his foundation's scholarship recipients, listening to their stories instead of reading reports. He'd visited the hospitals where the foundation funded treatments, shaking hands with families instead of just signing checks. He'd even called Daniel, his brother. and started the difficult work of forgiveness. Not because betrayal was acceptable, but because bitterness was a prison, and Grace had shown him the key. "You know what's strange?" Jimmy said. "I set out to test you, to prove that everyone was corrupt, but you tested me instead." Grace turned to face him fully. "I didn't test you." "Yes, you did. Every day, just by being who you are, by refusing to compromise, by choosing integrity when it cost you everything. You held up a mirror, and I had to decide whether I liked what I saw. And I'm still working on it, but I'm getting there." A cool breeze swept across the terrace, carrying the sound of laughter from inside. Through the glass doors, Jimmy could see donors writing checks, foundation staff coordinating with volunteers, lives intersecting in ways that would ripple outward long after tonight ended. "I need to tell you something," Grace said, her tone shifting slightly. "I've been thinking about expanding our reach. There are so many families in rural Georgia who don't even know foundations like ours exist. What if we created an outreach program? Mobile units that go to small towns, help people apply for aid, connect them with resources." Jimmy listened as Grace outlined her vision, detailed, thoughtful, ambitious. This was new too. 3 months ago, she'd hesitated to share ideas, convinced she didn't belong in this world. Now she spoke with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place. "How much would something like that cost?" Jimmy asked. I ran the numbers. Initial investment of about $200,000 for the first year, including vehicles, staff, and operational costs. But the impact... Grace's eyes lit up. "We could reach thousands of families who've fallen through the cracks." "Do it," Jimmy said simply. "Just like that. Just like that. This is your foundation as much as mine now, Grace. Your voice matters, your vision matters." He paused, then added, "You matter." Grace's eyes glistened. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, for seeing something I didn't see in myself. Thank you for not giving up on me when I'd given up on everyone else." As the gala wound down and guests began leaving, Jimmy found himself back at the terrace railing. Grace had gone inside to thank the volunteers, to hug the families they'd helped, to be the heart of something that had almost become heartless. Marcus appeared beside him, tablet in hand. "The donations are tallied, sir. We raised $2.3 million tonight, 30% more than last year." "Good. And the board wants to schedule a meeting about Grace's outreach proposal. They're enthusiastic." "Of course they are. It's brilliant." Marcus hesitated, then said, "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Always. I've worked for you for 8 years. I've seen you at your highest and your lowest, and I want you to know Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're different now. Better. The man I see today is the man I signed on to work for all those years ago." Jimmy felt emotion tighten his throat. "She did that, Grace." "No, sir. She showed you the way, but you chose to take it. That's on you." After Marcus left, Jimmy pulled out his phone and looked at the security footage he'd saved from that day. The day everything changed. He'd watched it dozens of times now, but tonight it hit differently. He saw Grace kneeling before the safe, saw her tears, saw her choice. But now he also saw himself, the man who'd created that test, the man who'd been so broken by betrayal that he couldn't recognize goodness standing right in front of him. That man was gone now, or at least that man was healing. Jimmy deleted the footage. He didn't need it anymore. He didn't need proof of Grace's integrity or evidence of his own transformation. He could simply live it, trust it, believe in it. Through the glass doors, he watched Grace laugh with a young mother whose daughter had just received a foundation scholarship. The mother was crying, and Grace pulled her into a hug. No barriers, no hesitation, just pure human compassion. "Integrity still lives," Jimmy whispered to the night sky, and for the first time in years he believed it. Grace Graham's integrity didn't just save her brother's life. It saved Jimmy Thomas's soul. Because in a world that had taught him to expect the worst, she'd shown him the best. She'd proven that goodness wasn't extinct, just hiding. That trust could be rebuilt, one honest choice at a time. That the walls we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that destroy us. Integrity had saved 2 lives that day. One in a hospital bed fighting to survive, and one in a penthouse office fighting to feel human again. Both won their battles. Both learned that who we are when no one is watching defines who we become when everyone is. And both discovered that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in vaults or bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in the quiet dignity of doing right when doing wrong would be so much easier. That's the miracle Grace gave Jimmy, and that's the legacy they built together. A foundation not just of charity but of character, not just of money but of meaning. Because at the end of the day, integrity didn't just change their lives. It proved that one honest choice, made in a moment of desperate temptation, can echo forward into eternity. And that, more than any wealth Jimmy Thomas ever accumulated, was worth everything. Would you have closed the safe, or taken what you needed to survive? Comment below, and subscribe if you believe integrity still changes lives, because stories like this remind us that goodness still exists in this world.